Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. I'm here today with Dave Jaarsma, Senior Manager of Customer Services Operations at Kev Group. Good morning, Dave. Welcome.
Morning, John. Thank you.
I want to start to talk to you about how you use communications in your daily working life. But first, perhaps you could just give us a little bit of context around what you do and what your work entails.
Sure. So Kev Group is a software company. We are in the ed tech sector, the K-12 ed tech sector. We make accounting software for schools and school boards, and also an online payment platform for parents. So the best way to describe it is if you have kids or nieces or nephews in the schools, you're maybe familiar with your kids going on a field trip, and maybe that field trip costs $10. So without our software, you as the parent would give little Johnny a $10 bill, perhaps in a Ziploc bag.
I remember carrying that $10 bill in a Ziploc bag.
Little Johnny hopefully remembers to bring that into class, and now the teacher needs to take the $10 bills from all of the little Johnnies in the class. They need to count it. They need to prepare kind of a deposit slip. They need to send some trustworthy volunteer down to the school office. Now the school office staff needs to recount all of that money and take it in from all of the different classes, prepare a bank deposit, get it over to the bank. So schools deal with an awful lot of money. So our software helps them manage that money, but with the online payment platform, parents don't have to send the $10 with little Johnny. They can just use their credit card, do an online payment checkout process using our software. They get automatic reminders when the field trip is due. And then, of course, it's not just field trips. It's also, spirit wear, prom and graduation is a big thing. All of the sorts of events that go on during the school year, our software helps manage the financial aspect of that.
It sounds like a really busy space, and I'm sure there's lots for us to discuss there. But since you brought up school and all of the little Johnnies and the little Daves out there, I'd love to sort of go back in time a little bit and hear from you what your experience with reading and writing education was like in your early school days.
Yeah, I think I always enjoyed writing. I remember in my kind of elementary school days, the creative writing assignments, and I, really poured a lot of my time and energy into writing the stories. My mother keeps all of this stuff. She has kept scrapbooks for my entire life, my siblings as well. So she keeps some of my, grade 3, grade 4 writing assignments, and I look back at them now.
Do you?
And I actually still remember writing some of those pieces because they were important to me. So I've always liked the creative writing aspect.
Do you think that fondness of your mother was encouraging, knowing that when you brought something home that it was
maybe.
Yeah,
I think it was more innate. I think I liked the creative aspect and telling a story. My favorite writer as a kid was Gordon Corman, who writes. There's a lot of humor in especially his earlier stuff, and I wanted to write like Gordon Corman. So I think that was instrumental. When I went into high school, I had a fantastic English teacher in my grade 12 year, Mrs. McClarkey, and she took grammar very seriously. And I'm sure many of your listeners are already rolling their eyes and they're thinking, okay, so grammar can never be interesting. Mrs. McClarkey made it interesting.
How did she do that? Do you remember?
I think she treated the class with respect, but also just impressed upon us that properly structuring your writing enhances clarity, how you make your argument. And for whatever reason, it clicked. She did a 2-week seminar on commas.
Wow.
You're also rolling your eyes
No,
at that.
I'm wrapped in attention. I've got my pen out. I'm taking notes from Miss McClarkey.
And it clicked with me. The 5-paragraph essay format just made inherent sense to me. There was a logic to it, and I could apply these rules. And I knew that my writing was was good as a result.
Yeah.
And I would sometimes write essays, and I would show them to my mother, and she would kind of do a proof before I would hand it in. And she'd read it out loud, and she's like, "What are you saying here?" And then I'd be like, "Oh, well, what I actually mean is," and then I would use it in my own words as I was speaking out loud. And she's like, "So write that." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, okay." So I think the combination of my mother's kind of guidance of when you write, sometimes you find your mind just going to this kind of floral, complicated sentence structure. Just, write it like you would say it, and then you apply some basic rules around how to structure it, and then it's good. And then you know that it's good. There's a sense of satisfaction at the end of the day that what you wrote is good.
I can totally relate, and I also can relate to the experience of having teacher parents who would engage me in a conversation around what I was trying to say. I think that I also did fall victim to that temptation, that pull to elevate my speech, and in doing so, lost a lot of clarity.
Right.
Probably even to the point where when I went back to look at what I had written, not really being able to identify what it was that I was originally trying to say.
Yeah.
I liken it to clothing when I talk to students about it. That most people would have a fairly strong sense of what an appropriate attire would be for a given social situation, whether it's a job interview or a party or a wedding, let's say, a more formal social situation, and that overdressing to a situation like that would be really awkward and would be as noticeable as underdressing.
Right.
And that seems to resonate, and yet being able to develop that sense does take time and takes those repetitions, that all of that. I want to hear more about that sort of journey, because I think there's so much there that's really instructive and informative for developing writers. But I wonder now, looking back at your own experience in that time, are you able to sort of imagine the person sitting next to you in the class, or the person sitting 2 rows behind you in class, and do you have some sense of what those other experiences might have been like? Do you think that everybody was really digging Miss McCluskey's two-week comma lesson, or do you think there were some people who were not as?
I can probably guarantee you I was maybe the only one who thoroughly enjoyed our comma seminar. I can certainly sympathize, right? And I look at my own children. So my daughters are 14 and 16, grade 8 and grade 10. And in their writing assignments, I think they struggle to connect what they're doing to the real world. I would suspect that my classmates in Mrs. McClarkey's class had no real sense of how disciplining your mind in order to communicate clearly was going to have any downstream impact. And when you're in grade 12, that's a hard thing to say, hey, you need to think about the larger life implications here. Yeah. It's fine to live in the moment. So, but I think my classmates also, were still able to certainly achieve success.
Sure.
I think they were just not as grounded in
and there might have been another class that was clicking for them, and another teacher that they're talking about these many years later, because that resonated with them. I love that expression that you just used, disciplining your mind to communicate with clarity and to create these sort of pathways for your thoughts to come through the way you want them. Mm-hmm. And it seems like something that probably is very accessible from different perspectives, that everybody would have some understanding of the idea of developing a discipline, a strength through repetition and practice. And if it's not writing, then it's dance or a sport or a martial art, right, or a musical instrument. And so trying to create, I think, this connection to activities that have maybe this more intrinsic motivation for somebody is one of the challenges of educators and of students too, because ultimately I think the students do know that they're ultimately the ones who are responsible here.
Now I think just thinking about my education and seeing my daughters also, it's changed, lo and behold, in the last number of years. Yeah. They do an astonishing amount of they don't use PowerPoint, but presentations that they need to do in class, which I never did during my elementary.
Yeah.
That's also communication.
Absolutely.
And how you design your slides. I'm not talking about the artistic kind of element. That's kind of part of it. But when you're prepping your slides, you are prepping an argument.
Yes.
You are deciding what words to include on that page, how many words. You're deciding how are you phrasing your argument? How are you drawing your audience? You're doing audience analysis.
Yes.
Because what you include on the slide would be different for audience A versus audience B.
Right.
Which has tremendous application to the working world. So it's still communication, what my kids are learning to do during class. It's not a 2-week seminar on commas.
Right.
But they're learning how to structure an argument and present that and design the flow of the information, how your recipient is kind of taking that in.
Yeah.
And I wish that I had had more grounding in that during my elementary, secondary, and post-secondary because I'd be able to hit the ground running so much better when I hit the working world.
That makes a lot of sense. What was your post-secondary education focused in?
So I really liked my grade 13 history class. I'm dating myself a little bit, back in the OAC era.
Right, we don't have grade 13 in Ontario high school anymore.
Yes, exactly. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So my older sister was already at the University of Waterloo in a history program, and she was in a co-op program where she did 4 months school, 4 months work, 4 months school, 4 months work. And she said, Davey, she's the only one who calls me that, you are coming to the University of Waterloo and you're going to do the co-op program. I'm like, okay. So I started off in history, but then I discovered when I got to University of Waterloo that they had an English program, as do most universities.
Sure.
But Waterloo had a sub-specialty in English called rhetoric and professional writing. So I applied for that and I got into that in second year. And that was the perfect fit for me. A pure English lit degree would not have been a good fit. I like to read,
sure.
But there's a point at which, and I still had to take lit classes as part of the curriculum, there would be a point where I'm reading this book and then writing an essay, on the book. And I'm like, so what is this for?
Yes.
But the rhetoric and professional writing was applied.
Yep.
So we took advertising classes. We took rhetoric classes. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. How do you persuade somebody of a point of view? Learn different techniques. There were some linguistics classes. But that, because I was in the co-op program, led to an initial career as a technical writer.
Right.
So it got me into the software world. We would produce, it was still kind of the era of written user manuals,
yes.
But the software industry was moving much more towards online user assistance. So we called it online help, which is now, I think, more like knowledge base and these sorts of things. So I did 6 work terms as a technical writer. I earned far more as a humanities undergrad in the software world than a lot of my, like the people who are still in history, for example.
Amazing.
And that got me into the software world. And then from technical writing, I did 7 years as a business analyst. And then I became a front-end web developer. And now I'm in my current role.
It's quite a journey. And as you're progressing from sort of position to position and sort of changing the nature of the work that you do, are you being pulled to the next thing, or do you find that you're getting maybe pushed a little bit as by technology changing the nature of the work that you're in currently, or a little bit of both?
I think it's all about keeping an open mind to open doors.
Right.
Sometimes in talking to my daughter, so my grade 10 daughter is starting to feel stressed because she has now made her course selections for grade 11, and she's feeling that that's now pushing her down a specific path. Yeah. And I hear her think there's only one path for her. That has not been my experience. So I was a tech writer. Yep. I was happy enough.
Yep.
But then a colleague had moved on to the IT department at Pearson Airport and connected me with somebody who was looking for a business analyst, and I just kind of morphed into that role. Yep. I learned that while I don't mind writing the written word, I actually much prefer designing information online. So the second half of the tech writing piece, and then when I was a business analyst, I was creating websites where I was still writing, but I was making choices about how do I structure the information on the web page? Yeah. What's my teaser? How do I hook the interest? How much information do I provide up front, and how much do I provide at a secondary level where I grab their attention, make them click a thing, and then bring them to the next level of information. And now in my current role, I do a lot of process improvement, and I need to visualize for people how the process is going to work. And so this probably sounds very abstract, but just to ground it in a real example.
That'd be great.
So we have a sales team. They try and sign up new school boards to buy our software. And then we have an implementation team. So once we have a client sign on the dotted line, our implementation team implements the software, and then they hand it over to our team, the customer success team. Our handoff process between all of those different steps has not been so good.
Okay.
So one of the major projects I've been working on lately is to make that better. So drawing on my experience as a business analyst, there's this technique called a swim lane diagram. And if you can picture an Olympic swimming pool, and you've got the lanes, everybody's got their own lane. So I map out the process as boxes in each department's lane. I've got the lane for the sales team. I've got the lane for the contracts team. I've got the lane for the client. And then I create boxes, and I describe the steps in each box, and I connect them with arrows and show kind of decision paths. So this is, a lot of people do this.
Yeah, and you're doing this on Word or PowerPoint?
Microsoft Visio.
Okay, Visio, okay.
But the tool doesn't really matter. It's how can I succinctly describe the step in just the right amount of information. I need to analyze my audience. I need to know what's required and what's not required. It's not a 5-paragraph essay.
No, but
it has a structure to it, and what I put in those boxes are important. So then, flow it all, I can then highlight where the problematic steps are, what causes the most time, what causes the most pain. Then I use that to drive the meeting that I hold, where I facilitate a conversation around how can we make this better?
Right.
This is the current state of the process. You can see that in step 3, there's all sorts of pain points. And then the people in the meeting are not reacting to a blank sheet of paper. They see my carefully structured flow. They can immediately say, oh yeah, step 3 is awful. Let me tell you more about that. And then I take some notes, and then we collectively create the future state process and then figure out all of the technological pieces in order to make that happen. So it has very much drawn on my time as a front-end web developer, where I was designing information flows online, on my experience as a tech writer and as a business analyst, where I've learned to know what information to include in the steps. And then it has very much informed how I facilitate and present this. So without the ability to really discipline my mind again and know what information to provide during the training session, during the requirements definition, all of it, my past experiences in different aspects of writing and information design kind of comes into play here.
That's fascinating and makes me think of so many questions. But the idea that you could draw a line going backwards from these really sophisticated and complex organizational and strategic thinking tasks and communication tasks that you have on your plate now, that you can draw a line back to not just the job that came before and the job that came before that, but all the way back to your post-secondary and secondary education, doing an entirely different writing genre, but one that is rooted in a skill set that provides the foundation for this growth. I think that's really, first of all, gratifying as an educator who might be making that case to students, but also really interesting just as a person to see how much time it takes to develop to the level that you're at now, and how hard it is perhaps when you're at the beginning of that process to even conceive of where it's going to take you.
Sure.
I think your advice to your daughter is really good advice, and probably all you can offer anybody at that stage, which is to just be in the present and focus on developing those sort of foundational skills, build a strong base, and then add something when the time comes, add the next interesting thing on top of that base.
Yep, absolutely.
I'm often drawn to movies for my analogies and my connections, movies and TV show and pop culture. And I think of the Karate Kid sequence where the protagonist is eager to learn the cool karate moves that he's seen, and his teacher insists on keeping him not just at the beginning of karate, but out in the yard painting a fence and washing a car, and he doesn't see what the purpose of all of that is. And then eventually he realizes that the movements that he is using to paint the fence and wash the car are the movements he'll use for the foundational techniques in karate. And there's that aha moment. Oh, actually, I've got a strong foundation. I can do these things.
Yeah, 100%.
What does it look like around you in the workplace now when the people that you're working with perhaps are now getting their communications education, their reading and writing education in the modern world, and not in the context that we had, where the pre-internet era? Do you find that those skill sets are different? Perhaps when you look around, do you see that the skill sets are changing? Do you wish maybe that more of your younger colleagues had that deep training in the 5-paragraph essay, or is that maybe a little bit romantic to think?
Probably a little romantic to think about the 5-paragraph essay. There's a time and a place for the 5-paragraph essay, but it's about structure. It's about knowing your audience and making choices to present an argument in a certain way. What I admire about a lot of my younger colleagues is their knowledge of different communication platforms. And I will happily call myself a dinosaur when it comes to a lot of that, and I know that I've got a lot to learn from my colleagues. In my current job, we need to communicate with customers. Right. So we inherit the customer after sales is done, after implementation is done, and now our customer success managers meet on a monthly basis with somebody from the customer to help them achieve their goals. So traditionally, that would be done through email and through meetings. But I just interviewed a young woman yesterday for an opening on our team. She has a lot of experience in producing TikTok videos. Now, we deal with accountants at school boards.
Right.
I don't know necessarily that TikTok videos would be a good future way of communicating, but it might.
But it might be?
It might.
Yeah.
And especially as the workforce starts to turn over, today's accountant at the school board might be close to retirement, perhaps,
right. Yep.
and we might have a kind of a younger generation coming in. I am really excited to learn from my younger colleagues how we can use alternative communication methods to connect with our clients. Email might not be the best way. We
Right.
need people well-versed in alternative communication methods to be able to connect with the customers. But in that communication, there needs to be structure.
Right.
There needs to, the message can't be all over the place. There needs to be a message.
Right.
Your thesis statement.
Sure.
My boss says in every point of contact with your customer, you have to have a point of view. Every question you ask them has to have an actual point behind it.
Sure.
And that's all drawn from knowing how to communicate effectively.
Right. Those questions that I heard you articulate a few minutes ago when you were talking about your approach to some business writing project or some kind of internal strategy session where you were sort of thinking out loud, who is my audience and what do they need and what are my... Was that part of your training too, that sort of approaching the communication task with a kind of planning stage? Was that something that got taught into your writing and thinking process, or was that something that you developed just sort of through training and practice?
A combination of the two. I think your academic instruction is always going to be theoretical to some extent.
Yeah.
So I know that when I was in the UW's the Rhetoric and Professional Writing program a number of years ago now, like we certainly had classes where we learned to create kind of these audience profiles and then determine how we were going to write differently for each. But it's just theory.
Yeah.
Well-grounded theory, good knowledge to have. Yeah. But then when you're in the workplace, you start to see it in a much more applied context. When I was writing, user manuals and the online version of those, our particular product at the time was aimed at a system administrator, so somebody with a high level of technical knowledge. So I would write it from that perspective, whereas if my mother was reading that, she would have no clue of what I was saying, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So you start, and then I worked for a different software company which had a completely different audience, and the nature of the writing completely changed because that audience was different. So it starts to coalesce.
Right.
The theory then migrates into kind of real life, and you just start to intuit after a while how to write something in order to reach the appropriate type of audience.
The experiences that you're sharing and the insights that you're sharing are I think, really useful for students. But as I'm listening to you talk, I'm also thinking through my sort of educator lens, and there are so many interesting ideas popping up in that part of my brain about what it means to be a communications professor now, with all of the technological change and the expansion of what it means to communicate and the way that we do it. And I am drawn to that insight you shared about you learning from your junior colleagues in the same way that you might impart upon them some wisdom. And I think probably there's the need for a similar kind of reciprocation between teachers, professors, educators who are rooted in a tradition that has some of these really strong fundamentals, a reciprocation between that base and student base who's coming up into this relationship with not just a familiarity with these newer forms of communications, but also some innate sense of those style expectations, right? Like I talked about earlier, that sense of I know what is appropriate to wear at this party or that job interview.
Yep.
That's probably a situation where I wouldn't have those innate insights into what is expected. And so trying to create those opportunities to bridge the gap is I think, one of my challenges and one of the things that I'm interested in doing right now. I wonder if this isn't a good place to start to transition into talking about the sort of future of your workplace. How do you see these trends playing out? The idea that someone might make a sales pitch through a TikTok video is a great example. What does the next 5 years of business communications look like, do you think, based on the way things are going now?
I find it hard to predict. I would say attention spans are less, for me too. I find it increasingly difficult to focus, for a prolonged period of time on one thing. I think just with all of the different factors in our lives has kind of led us all to. I don't mean to say shorter attention spans is a bad thing. It's just kind of a reality. So when it comes to then workplace communications, I think in my immediate job, we're going to be much more video-based. So instead of like a 20 or a 30-minute, explanation of, new features that we're rolling out and the benefits of it, short 3 to 5 minutes. But to get content down to that level of succinctness, if that's a word, requires real skill.
Right.
Perhaps your students can also identify with, it's easier to write a longer piece sometimes than a much shorter piece.
Yes.
You dump a whole bunch of stuff onto the paper or onto the computer screen or whatever it is, but then editing it down is the trick. So I think that those skills are going to become increasingly valuable. And while ChatGPT, for example, I think offers advantages in generic contexts, when you are trying to reach the 50-year-old school office staff who is trying to solve problem X, that's highly specific.
Yes.
having the skills to be able to take the content down to a hard-hitting 5 minutes.
Yes.
That's not just written, but it's actually designed visually.
Yes.
I think that's where we're going. I don't know about the other platforms. I still don't know that TikTok itself has a place in our immediate kind of context, but maybe. And there's always new technologies coming out.
Right.
I don't know where the world's going to be in 10 years.
And it could be that the skills that allow someone to be good at producing a TikTok video are then the skills that allow them to be very good at the next communication platform, or even they port over onto the production of that 5-minute video that you said is going to be more formal, perhaps, but those editing skills or some of the features that you talked about in terms of designing a web page. How do I grab someone's attention? How do I persuade them to read on? How do I drive them to click? All those techniques might become sort of translated into a video context.
Right. Yeah. So when I'm interviewing, and our company's really growing. So I think I was employee number 70 2 years ago, and we're at 130 now. So kind of rapid growth.
Yeah.
So we're doing an awful lot of hiring. When somebody is too rambly in their interview, they're probably not going to make it to the second round.
Okay.
I can tell when somebody has prepared ahead of time to structure an argument, which is what an interview is. It is an argument that you are a worthy candidate in different areas. You can tell when somebody's thought processes and their way to articulate why they are a good candidate, their answers to the questions, whether they're good or whether they're weak. And if somebody's all over the place and can't make a point, I'm going to discount them.
Do you ever see people come into an interview with paper and pen and making notes as they go?
It's all virtual.
Okay.
So I haven't seen that specifically, but I can tell when they've prepped. But it's not about preparation. It's about how do they articulate clearly and with a point.
Yes, on the fly, taking in the question, going through the steps of here are all the things I could talk about. Let's get rid of those 3. I've got these 3 things left. What order do I line them up in? What are the things that I can say to connect those dots? Go.
Yeah. What's your point of view?
Yeah.
And now how do you support that?
It's making me wonder what the interviews you're doing now would look like stacked up against the interviews that you did along the way. Obviously, they would have been in person and not over Zoom, but do you feel like those skills were the same skills that were sort of being sought after or being looked for in those job interviews that you did along the way? No.
I think back in the early part of my career, there was a focus on the tools that you knew.
Interesting.
I remember still the number of words per minute you could type was a thing.
Wow.
That's really no longer the case. In my tech writing phase of my career, one of the main software tools kind of in the industry was FrameMaker.
Okay.
And then RoboHelp was a type of software that was used to kind of create the online version of that. WebWorks was another. Anyways, these would be questions in the interview, like what is your level of proficiency with these tools? Honestly, John, I don't care. When I am interviewing a candidate now, I assume that the generation hitting the workforce can handle software tools.
Yeah.
I think that they can learn it very, very quickly. I want to know, can they think? And can they take those thoughts and present them clearly?
Right.
So that tends to be much more my focus of my interview questions, not do you know Microsoft Word?
Right.
And Salesforce is one of our big tools as well. I can teach you that stuff, and I'm not worried about that at all. But can you articulate clearly and create a connection with your audience? Because that's the mark of success for the CSMs, the customer success managers that we're hiring.
That's so interesting. And I wonder if, maybe there isn't a way in which those really deeply human skills, those interpersonal skills, what might have been dubbed the soft skills, I wonder if there isn't a way in which they can eventually mesh with the development of new communication platforms, like maybe that TikTok video that we keep referring back to isn't being sent necessarily to actually pitch the sales product, but it's being used to develop the relationship.
Yeah.
Right. That it's maybe more personal, where a salesperson might have in the past, asked after your kids and followed up on some kind of important date just to build that relationship. That now this TikTok video is sort of custom made for them on their anniversary or their school's big win or what have you.
Yeah, totally agree.
Wow, that's so interesting. What do you? I know from our relationship that you're a sports fan and an athlete, and that you've coached, and so you have some experience and insight into sort of breaking down game skills into the kinds of drills that might develop those skills. I wonder, what as an employer or as a hiring manager. What kinds of drills or activities or assessments could you imagine being useful to your 2 years in the future hire? What would you have them working on now to get better at thinking, to get better at being clear, to get better at being logical in their thoughts? Like I realize that's kind of my job as the educator, but I'm curious to know what you might identify based on real world action as being a kind of core skill that you would try to isolate.
So it's something that we have changed in our own onboarding process for new hires is we introduce role play. Internal, so we're doing a fake meeting that you are preparing for, and you're going to deliver it to our senior director and our VP. You need to come up with the agenda for this fake meeting, and there's certain things that you're going to need to present. And then our senior director and VP are going to pretend to be the client, and they're going to ask you any number of questions from a predefined list that we give. So there's a level of kind of prep that they do. We are now also on an annual basis doing role play, not as part of the onboarding process, but just as a matter of keeping your skills up to date with your peers. So again, it's low pressure, right? Like nobody outside the company is seeing this. This is just with your peers. And crowdsourcing suggestions from a qualified group. Crowdsourcing to an unqualified group would not be helpful. But with your colleagues who know the job, and they will say, you mentioned, subject X in this particular way. Have you thought about doing it this way? Or let me give you an example of where I did that and it went totally off the rails. And I realized I should really do it this way. And every client is different.
Sure.
Every employee, every Kev staff person has kind of a different way, and that's fine. There's not any one way necessarily, but it's something that we're trying to do much more is being less didactic. Is that the right word?
Sure.
Of where we're like, read these instructions about how to do your job and now do it that way.
Yes, absolutely.
And make it much more about relationship building internally as well.
Right,
and
developing that ability to read and
from
react.
Colleagues. Yeah, which is something we never did when I was younger in my career.
That sounds kind of intense. And have you been through some of these?
We're 6 months into this kind of experimental process. I think it's going well.
Yeah, do you feel yourself drawing on some of the things that you've
learned? For sure. Yeah, there's always wisdom from your colleagues, and when you're younger versus when you're older, like it's not a generational thing. There's seasoned wisdom from the kind of more experienced people, but the younger folks have a tremendous amount of ideas. They're more willing to try alternative approaches. They offer fantastic observations. So I think our team is stronger as a result.
Well, that sounds like an amazing professional development project, and I can very much see those kinds of activities being the future of communications education, moving away from the paper that gets written and read by one figure and putting those communication skills out into the public sphere, protected by the classroom environment, and crowdsourcing insights and feedback and getting those repetitions under your belt so that you're building that foundation for the next step. And I see it here as well. The experiences and insights that you've shared about your journey to where you are today, and also where you see the field going, I think would be really, really useful to people listening. I think that connecting people who are on their way up to people who have taken that path is another example of building those connections, getting us out of our silos, and allowing those skills to multiply through connection with others. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all of the ideas that you've shared, and I hope that your next hire will show you how to make that great TikTok video that you've been dying to make.
Well, my daughters would be pleased. So yes,
thanks very much, Dave. Take care.
All right, thanks.
And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.